Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I am Ramayad, Senior Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you in our studios. It's not every day that one has the feeling of doing one's job and serving a cause at the same time, the cause of human dignity. I had that feeling when I served the French government as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Human Rights a few years ago. What's going on in Sudan is a tragedy, a forgotten tragedy. It is the largest refugee crisis in the world, and that is why this event is so special. And the format unique, a one-on-one conversation with one of the most powerful voices of the human rights community in the world, Human Rights Watch, and its new Executive Director, Tirana Hassan. Welcome, Tirana. Thank you for traveling from New York to come here with us today. The Africa Center houses a 10-year task force dedicated on Sudan. Since the civil war started in April 2023, following a coup d'etat in October 2021, we have been tracking relentlessly the situation in the country. But what we have been seeing these days is beyond the thinkable. We are now facing a tremendous question: has a genocide started in Sudan? What words should be used to describe the killings, the murders, the rapes, the torture, the targeting of specific populations? Human Rights Watch just published a 218-page report, "The Masalit Will Not Come Home: Ethnic Cleansing and Crimes Against Humanity in El Geneina, West Darfur, Sudan." In this report, you document crimes against humanity, war crimes. You document that the RSF targeted the predominantly Masalit neighborhoods of El Geneina in relentless waves of attacks. Are we back to the dark days of this period when the genocide, the first of the 21st century, had culminated in a large-scale massacre with the Janjaweed forces? It was in Darfur too. The Masalit were already targeted. Tirana Hassan, welcome to the Atlantic Council. And before diving to the Masalit case, maybe a few insights about the overall situation in Sudan. Simple questions: how many victims? How many people died? The number of refugees? Where are they located? Who is responsible?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for creating this space, because I think when we start talking about what is happening in Darfur, or Sudan as a whole, we cannot start this conversation without acknowledging that this is an ongoing catastrophe, and lives are being lost because it is being largely ignored by the international community. So creating this space is incredibly important. I mean, just to give give everybody who's watching a sense of the scale of what we're talking about in terms of human suffering. We are looking at 10 million people who have been displaced because of the fighting that has taken place over the last 15 months. At least 2 million of those have been displaced or have moved across borders. Many of them are refugees in Chad, where the humanitarian situation is absolutely dire, and we can get to the humanitarian situation at the moment. In a moment, we have the UN is talking about approximately 2.5 million people who are on the verge of famine. There's a lot of language when we talk about famine or food insecurity, but I want to make one thing very clear, is that what we are talking about is 2.5 million people who are going to starve to death. If they don't actually physically starve to death, they will die because of hunger-related illnesses. So we are talking about a scale of human catastrophe that we have not seen for a very long time. This could potentially be the second largest, if not the largest, man-made or created famine on the African continent in modern history.
And a few days ago, we saw 3 United Nations agencies UNICEF, World Food Programme, and WHO, who issued a stark warning that all indications are point to a significant deterioration of the nutrition situation on the ground.
That's right. And, you know, we should not get caught up. One of the reasons that people keep on waiting, and it's a nonsense to wait for this declaration of famine, the reason, famine is a very technical term. It requires a survey to be declared. But it gets to the point that the warring parties, in this case in Darfur, the Rapid Support Forces, have not allowed unfettered humanitarian access into the millions of people who require humanitarian assistance, let alone being able to do the sorts of assessments to declare the magnitude and scale of the food crisis, of the nutrition crisis. But we have seen hospitals that have been attacked. We know that medical supplies are not getting in, not just in Darfur, but because they're being blocked by the Rapid Support Forces, who have set up their own humanitarian system to actually where they're charging exorbitant taxes and rates to humanitarian agencies and workers to be able to bring goods in and out. But the same thing is happening through the Sudanese armed forces in the areas that they control in Port Sudan and in areas of Khartoum as well. So we have an overall humanitarian crisis. There is something that can be done about it. We know that there are humanitarian agencies.
It's a race against time, right?
It is. And if the warring parties, if the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces were to actually meet their obligations under international humanitarian law, then they would allow free access of humanitarian agencies to actually get to those in most need, and that would result in the lives of millions.
And in April, we noticed that the World Food Programme decided to suspend. It's an incredible paradox to suspend its aid because of the financial constraints. This is something that is really incredible at the very moment when people need this aid.
That's right. I mean, this is when we come back to where we started, which is the forgotten crisis that Sudan is being referred to. And unfortunately, it's not the first time that we have heard Sudan being referred to in this way. But this...
And Chad also.
And Chad also.
Yeah. This is what is incredible too, because the country they are heading to is also suffering from the same problems.
That's right. It's not only does Chad
crisis,
have, exactly. Not only is Chad in its own vulnerable situation, but you know, our researchers have been in the camps in Chad. They have seen how woefully inadequate the financing and humanitarian relief is for the numbers of people who are flooding in across the border. And as the fighting continues in El Janina, in El Fasher, where it is currently, you know, at its worst, we are seeing, you know, thousands, predominantly women and girls from Al Fasher, who are trying to leave to find safety in places like Chad. But you know, you'll notice that I said that it was women and girls who were leaving Chad. One of the reasons that we're seeing predominantly women and girls trying to leave at great peril and risk is because men are often profiled and stopped by the RSF because they are non-Arab and they can be accused of being part of the Masalit fighting forces or the Darfur fighting forces and can be arrested or killed. And there have been cases that Human Rights Watch has documented of people trying to flee. And we've actually documented in the case of El Janina incidences where civilians who were fleeing were actually targeted because they were from the non-Arab Masalit and other non-Arab communities by the RSF and their allied militias and killed whilst en route.
So maybe we can now focus on the case you highlight in this very important report, the Masalit. For the people who listen to this, would you tell us more about the Masalit, who they are, and why they are being targeted right now?
Sure. The Masalit are a non-Arab tribe, which are predominantly living in the Darfur region. But it's not just the Masalit who are being targeted by the fighting forces, particularly the Rapid Support Forces in El Janina. There are also other non-Arab communities which are being targeted. And this harks back to, 20 years ago, when we are talking about the genocide that unfolded in Darfur.
Exactly, in the same place, West Darfur.
That's right, yeah. Well, we saw it happening in the west of Sudan. We saw it happening in North, South, and West Darfur. All three regions of the Darfur state were affected, and these communities were targeted. And we're seeing the same patterns of abuses.
So this civil war is also an ethnic war.
Yes, we have our research in El Janina has documented the targeting of the Muslim and non-Arab communities. We believe that from the evidence that we gathered that crimes against humanity have been committed. And when we're talking about crimes against humanity, we're talking about murder. We're talking about the houses of the Masalit and other non-Arab communities being targeted, them being forcibly driven from their homes. We have documented terrible cases of sexual violence and widespread cases of sexual violence where rapid support forces and their allied militias have gone into homes actually looking for women, raping them, and in some cases actually keeping them as sort of sexual slaves or hostages for a number of days when they were raped multiple times. And in one case in particular that sort of haunts me, that my colleagues documented, was that they actually said that the intention was to get the survivor, the victim, pregnant. And the reason that this haunts me not only is just how horrific these crimes are, but how the parallels to what we heard and documented back during the genocide 20 years ago.
So everything you are describing right now, like you just said, reminds us what happened a few years ago. There's murders, rapes, etc. But there's also the choice of the wording. Some people may question the reality of these crimes because the right words are not used. So how should we, if it reminds us so much what happened before, should we talk about genocide and why the word is used everywhere but not legally accepted yet?
Sure. I mean, I think let's start with, genocide is a crime. And within international law, one thing that we should note is there's no hierarchy of horror when it comes to international humanitarian law and war crimes and crimes against humanity. They are all horrific. The technical issue when it comes to the crime of genocide is really, for us, you have to prove intent. So the intention to destroy in part or in whole a group. This may be just clearly a point of, have we got the evidence to prove that level of intention?
Okay.
But I think we shouldn't, there is very clear evidence of crimes against humanity, of forced displacement, of killings, of targeted killings, of torture, the destruction of civilian infrastructure. All of these are the crimes of the most serious magnitude that require an international response. These are crimes within international law, and we have to remember that there are things that can be done. These aren't horrors that are taking place in a vacuum. There are pathways for international justice, the International Criminal Court, and we have seen the prosecutor recently actually making a call for evidence to be given to his office and for him to be able to collaborate with those collecting evidence so that they are able to prosecute. As Human Rights Watch, we've actually documented in detail the crimes, and we have actually been able to identify 6 particular members of the rapid support forces and their allied militias who have been responsible for these crimes, for crimes against humanity. And that is a very good starting point for where governments can actually take action, including things like sanctions, but also these are these are individuals, including the leader of the RSF,
General Hemeti.
Exactly, and his brother, and other leaders of the RSF and those that are working with them. And those individuals should be investigated for war crimes. And if there is solid evidence, then there should be arrest warrants issued for them.
So about this evidence, are you working closely with the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan? Because we know that 2 weeks ago, in a video posted on social media, he urged victim groups, civil society organizations to provide any evidence they can have and material relating to the ongoing atrocities. So are you working with the International Criminal Court on this?
One of the things that Human Rights Watch does and that we use our evidence collection for is not only to put that evidence in front of governments like the United States governments and other governments who have some leverage on this conflict to get them to act and use all the tools in their toolkit to be able to respond and save civilian lives, but we also do it for the intention of ensuring there's accountability for the perpetrators of these crimes. Of course, the International Criminal Court is a very powerful avenue, and Human Rights Watch was actually involved in the establishment of the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute at its conception. And so when it comes to the case of Darfur, all of our evidence that we find, that we have documented, is in the public domain. And like in many other cases of international justice that the court has brought forward, our findings that we have made public can be used as important parts of building those cases for justice and accountability.
You said that history is repeating itself in Darfur. And I mentioned earlier the Janjaweed, and we know that the RSF, many of the RSF people are the successors of these Janjaweed. So what did we miss after all this time? What did we miss so much that we find the same actors committing the same crimes here? And it was documented. The word genocide has been said and recognized at that time.
Absolutely. So we didn't miss anything. This was a series of missteps and miscalculations by the international community at the end of the first Darfur war. And I think it comes back actually to what we were just talking about the importance of justice and accountability. Because there were conversations that took place during the peace negotiations at the end of the Darfur war where international brokers of the peace agreement decided that there would be no peace if there was a pursuit for international justice. There was a sense that this would get in the way and stop some of these actors that were involved from the Darfur crisis, the genocide, from actually sitting at the table. And as a result, a free pass was given to individuals who were implicated in serious crimes of international law, atrocity crimes. And these are the two men, the two generals that sit before us today, Mohammed Daglo Hamdan Hemeti and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. These two individuals were actively involved, one as one of the leaders of the Janjaweed, who was incredibly close to Omar al-Bashir, and one
both of them.
And one who actually worked for him as a member of the SAF, as the Sudanese Armed Forces. And these two individuals, they were never prosecuted internationally. There was no domestic justice, nor did we have any illusion that there would be any sort of justice process domestically at that point in time. But they were actually brought into the fold, and that was actually one of the most dangerous steps that was taken, because that is when Hemeti and his forces, the Janjaweed forces, were actually brought in and legitimized, and their slate was wiped clean of all of the atrocity crimes that they had committed, and they were then renamed the Rapid Support Forces and sort of brought in to the overall structure of the Sudanese armed forces.
And between two ethnic wars, there has been a revolution, a democratic revolution led by mostly young Sudanese and women too. So this is a very dynamic civil society in Sudan. So I would like to maybe mention how you are working to investigate on the ground. Are you partnering with them? Are you working closely with the Sudanese, this very dynamic and very conscientious civil society in Sudan?
Absolutely. You know, there are obviously not only there are Darfuri groups and there are groups in Sudan, because we're talking a lot about what is happening inside Darfur when it comes to the ethnic cleansing and the fighting between and the atrocities that are being committed by the Rapid Support Forces. But there's also active fighting in other parts of the country, including in Khartoum. And we know that there are human rights defenders, human rights groups, civil society groups, those who are at the forefront of leading the revolution back in 2018. And they are continuing to do their work. And actually, it has been something that Human Rights Watch has documented, that many of the brave human rights groups and human rights defenders and lawyers who have been working to ensure that there's accountability for previous crimes, who are working for democracy, have actually been the target.
And to make the former dictator Bashir accountable of his regime.
That's right. And they have actually been targeted. In El Geneina, actually, Human Rights Watch documented lawyers and civil society leaders who were actually targeted by the RSF forces during these attacks.
They know how powerful their voices is and their efficiency too.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think there's something else. It's not only about how Human Rights Watch works with Sudanese civil society groups, but it is about ensuring that the US government, when it looks at trying to find solutions and interventions, and when we are talking to the international community about what needs to happen in Sudan right now, the people that need to be listened to is not just Human Rights Watch with our reports, but it is also the Sudanese human rights defenders who are on the ground every day, who actually know what the answers are, and they can tell and inform governments about how to create a pathway out.
In your report, you mentioned many key recommendations, waiting answers or creative solutions from the United Nations to African Union member states, including the ICC state parties. Before talking about the UN and maybe the African countries, what about the United States? We are here in Washington. Washington has an important role in shaping the international agenda. And Washington has always been very focused on Sudan. U.S. Special Envoy Tom Perriello has been appointed. A few months ago, in April 2024, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar wrote to him. We hosted her here at the seat where you are right now to talk about this, wrote a letter to him to highlight the Sudanese women case and the Sudanese women human rights defenders, and women-led civil society organizations. What the United States can do here, are they doing enough? Are you working with the United States to advance the agenda of your key recommendations? What could the United States do and better?
The United States could do a lot more. It's a very short answer. We have not seen any sort of robust response from the United States, from the US government. At no point in time have we seen the US government utilize the tools that it has at its disposal, or has it been able to leverage resources simply to reduce the human suffering that we are seeing.
And impunity. Yeah.
That's right. Let's take
Yeah, there are many levels of action possible.
There are many levels of action. And one thing that we should remember is that it's actually a failure of the US government because we know the US government can do better. Under the Bush administration in 2004, we saw George Bush's administration actually take a lead when it came to Sudan, to speak out about the atrocities, and it was one of the most significant contributors to the humanitarian effort, which was so central to saving lives in Darfur back then. So we know the US can do better, and we have not seen them leverage their power and their resources.
And why? Why didn't they?
That is an excellent question. And I think that one could argue, and we have heard excuses being made, that there is just so much going on in the world.
Like Ukraine and Gaza.
That's right.
Make us busy.
And the reality is that what we are seeing unfold in Sudan requires exactly the same type of robust international response and response from the United States government that we saw them deliver in Ukraine, and we have not seen that sort of response necessarily in Gaza, but we haven't even seen the type of heavy, the type of diplomatic pressure and using international leverage and diplomacy. And so one thing that even would indicate that the United States government was going to be more serious and take the serious situation in Sudan more seriously is simply having the Special Envoy's office fully resourced, and the Special Envoy should be answering directly to President Biden himself.
Which means it's not the case.
That's right. And so we need to see now is a more robust response, not just from let's not talk about the US government in some sort of amorphous body. Let's talk about President Biden. It is President Biden that is able to lead this administration. It is not solely up to USAID, and we have seen some comments in the past weeks from Samantha Power. But we need to see a more robust response and active engagement from the president himself, because that's what atrocity crimes of this severity deserve if the US wants to continue its standing as a champion of human rights in the world.
Of course. And there's also what the US could do with its partners, meaning foreign actors. We know that Iran, Russia are involved in this, providing their influence or advice or whatever to the forces on the ground. Also the Emirates. So what's going on with the EU? Because they have denied providing weapons on Sudan. So what's the role of these foreign actors, and how could we or the international community could influence them and could influence the events on Sudan through them?
I think, when we talk about the foreign actors, we have said there has been some documentation. There has been plenty that's been written in the press about weapons being supplied from. There have been some documentation of Iranian drones that have been used by the Sudanese armed forces. There has also been documentation by the panel of experts on Sudan, the UN panel of experts, that has linked the United Arab Emirates and weapons being supplied to the Sudanese armed forces. Has been well documented that there are a number of different actors. Both sides of both of the generals, both Burhan and Hemeti, over the last few years as they have been in power, have continued to build alliances with China, with Russia, with the UAE, with Egypt. So I think when we are talking about the collection of actors that could use their leverage on the warring parties, that's an important step. then also we need to talk about when there is evidence that there are other states who are either supplying weapons, and in the case of the Darfur region, that's actually, there is an arms embargo. So supplying weapons to forces to fight in Darfur actually breaches that embargo. And so ensuring that there is accountability and that the United States takes action on those states where there is evidence that they are supplying weapons, that's one concrete step. Another concrete step that could be taken is actually expanding the arms embargo and leading the United Nations to expand the arms embargo beyond Darfur to all of Sudan, because that would actually capture a wider net of states and individuals who may be complicit in providing weapons.
And speaking of United Arab Emirates, what more can be done to engage Arabic-speaking audiences? I'm asking because when it comes to Gaza, for example, when Arab states don't act or don't move, their public opinions have mobilized themselves, and this mobilization has been a game changer to bring the situation of the Gaza populations on the top of the diplomatic agenda and as a topic of interest, So if the states don't listen, could the public opinions do something?
I think that public opinion, particularly where leaders listen to their constituencies, particularly in democracies. But actually, there's always a role for civil society. There is always a role. Silence is not an option when it comes to we can all do something. And so while that is one part of how we could move power we need to remember that states, and not just states, but let's not give a free pass to the regional groupings. We haven't talked at all about the African Union.
That was my last African states.
That's right, African states and African unions. And here we have, we have 3 African states on the Security Council, the A3 as they are commonly known. And we have seen, and everybody is looking to the A3 states to provide leadership. We keep hearing this excuse, and I can tell you that Human Rights Watch has been pounding on the door of all of the members of the Security Council at the UN, and we consistently hear this excuse. We must see the A3 lead, and if we don't see the A3, there is nothing we can do, and that is just untrue. The A3 should be playing a leadership role. The African Union should be playing a leadership role. And we have seen recently that there has been some movement at the African Union, and now we're moving to that important part of the discussion. The AU is wanting to get suggestions for what they can do in terms of a plan for protection of civilians.
They appointed, the African Union appointed some panel. Have you heard about that? What are they doing?
Well, the African Union right now has envoys, which is going to be looking at Sudan. And what we need to have the African Union and the envoys are able to make recommendations to think through what is a robust plan for protection of civilians. And we haven't really gotten to protection of civilians. We've talked a lot today about the horrors that have been unfolding. But if we want, and we've talked about justice, all of these things are important. But between now and the end of tomorrow, there is the potential for dozens more people to be dead, to be killed, to be raped, to be displaced. And that's why we have to shift the conversation and the action of the international community, and this should be led by the African Union, but not only the African Union and African states. We should be talking about a coalition of states from all regions, all over, because this is the seriousness that this conflict requires, to look at how would we be able to mobilize resources and actual, a physical presence on the ground that would allow some sort of protection of civilian presence that would actually be able to deliver on security for the most vulnerable. And in this conflict, the most vulnerable are civilians. And in Darfur, those civilians are mostly from the Masalit and other non-Arab tribes.
Perfect. All right. That is exactly what is important here to hear from you, from Human Rights Watch. I would like to thank you because I think we are arriving to the end of this conversation. You mentioned a lot of possibilities of actions, civilian protection mission, humanitarian assistance, countrywide arms embargo, targeted sanctions, accountability, mobilization of the Security Council, including the African countries. Also, President Biden personal mobilization. So this is a roadmap of what should be done or could be done that is not being doing right now. So I would like to thank you and invite our members and viewers to look into this important report on your website. And a final word to thank you, Tirana, for accepting to testify about what your teams have seen on the ground and what you have been able to document about the crimes in Sudan. So thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch to continue this discussion until this ethnic war ends. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks.